This chapter absolutely hurt. And that's it. There's really no other feeling I could get from this. What happened to Dora in this chapter was so completely unfair that it actually affected my mood and made me want to stop reading it at about the halfway point. And it's all because of this piece of crap right here. Which, trust me, if this wasn't the first 30 seconds of the video, I would have a lot more to say. Never have I held so much resentment for a character that only shows up in a total of like 4 panels and then is never heard from again. We don't even know his name, and yet I am actually hoping that somehow, some way, he ends up becoming the final villain of the series, just so we can see all of our main characters take turns beating the life out of him. And if that does end up happening, I am looking forward to Dora getting his turn. Anyway, speaking of our main characters, we definitely had to talk about Cross and Maru, because after this chapter, I now 100% understand how the two of them ended up the way they did. We also had to talk about Jabaloma, because there's a bit to unpack there. And of course, after this chapter, we walk away with a completely new outlook around Dora. Turns out the mean-looking guy who everyone's calling the new Sukuna actually is a pretty decent dude. But before we can get into any of that, we have to talk about Dora. Because even though anyone who's ever read a story knew the second he appeared that he was not making it out of this flashback, the way Gege wrote him made you want to see him break that trope and somehow ended up surviving this. It's funny how in the same week, both this and One Piece essentially condemned a character in a flashback to meet a tragic end after spending a majority of said flashback getting the fans to like the character. Though to be fair, we spent a lot less time with the character here and got to his ending a lot faster. But just like his flashback brethren in One Piece, Dora meets his end by choosing to sacrifice himself in order to protect the people he cares about, in this case his entire tribe. Because coming off the ending of the last chapter, we found out that the daughter of a Deskunte chieftain was killed by one of the Callians, the beast the Remlians consider to be sacred. In fact, we find out that they actually do have a real spiritual connection to the creatures, where their third eyes will cry whenever one dies, something that is wholly unique to their tribe, with all the other tribes only crying at their birth and on the day they die. We also learned that their third eye doing this puts an extreme toll on their bodies, which is probably a reason why, beyond the religious ones, the Remlians were against wiping out the Callians, because there's a huge risk of them dying due to the strain. Which honestly, I doubt the Deskunte even care about, because as far as they're concerned, wiping out the Remlians and the Callians at the same time is just basically killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Either way, they're ultimately getting what they want as an end result. Last thing about their third eyes, we find out that they are the source of their cursed energy, or as they call it, Roaloka. Which explains why every time we've seen Maru use his abilities, it starts with a flash from that eye. But anyway, after his daughter's death, the Deskunte chieftain demanded that the Remlians take responsibility for it by handing over control of the canal and the land they were currently living on. You know, the land they were forced onto by the Deskunte in the first place, and are now being forced to a much worse area that would all but guarantee their death. The only chance they have of stopping this is by winning a trial by combat. Something that apparently the Deskunte often use to settle disputes, where each side chooses a champion and then they fight to the death, the winner deciding which side was ultimately right. And this is the only credit I'll give to this tribe in this video. It's implying that even in the instances where they lose, they do hold up their end of the agreement. But I have to take that credit right back, because just one look at this man tells me everything I need to know, and that he had no intention of honoring their agreement to let the Remlians off the hook. But again, this was their only real chance of surviving this. So Dora, as the strongest Remlian by far, steps up, choosing to fight for their sake and the sake of peace between the tribes they worked so hard to build. And just like his counterpart from One Piece, his sacrifice ultimately failed. Because the Deskunte tipped the scales in their favor by choosing Dora as their champion, who, just by stepping into the arena without even throwing a single punch, his presence alone completely overwhelmed everyone there. And before the battle even began, they could all tell that the only thing waiting for Dora at the end of this fight was a brutal death. So much so that Cross even breaks his calm demeanor and begs Dora just to run away. But here's the thing, the reason Dora was chosen to fight is because he had won a previous fighting contest held by the Deskunte, where despite the Remlians being known to be much weaker than the Horned Samorians, he still easily beat all of his opponents. So, by that logic, the others thought that he was sure to win here too. But what they didn't know was that there were people much more powerful than Dora who, for one reason or another, chose not to participate, Dora being one of them, who we also end up finding out is Dora's childhood friend and is only participating in this fight because the Deskunte in charge kidnapped his sister in order to force his hand. So this is a battle that's tragic from every single angle that you look at it. Dora forced into a battle he couldn't possibly win against his best friend, Dora forced to kill his best friend or risk his sister being killed by her kidnappers. And the Remlians are forced to watch the man that gave them hope be brutally beaten down after pushing all the responsibility on his shoulders. And we'll get to the aftermath of his tragic death in a bit, but first, I do want to talk a bit more about Dora. Because even knowing that he was going to die, he still chose to make the most of his final moments by revealing the real reason that Deskunte forcefully pushed the Remlians out of their home. Turns out our theory about those rocks Dora told the twins not to touch was true, and they actually were special. They're a type of ore called mule, which can be used to convert Roluka into energy, which the Deskunte greedily wanted for themselves in order to make themselves even wealthier. And despite his pleas falling on deaf ears, Dora uses his last words to plead to the other tribes to not use the excuse of this being a religious conflict so that they can avoid getting involved and recognize the true reasoning behind this hostile takeover of their land and aid the Remlians in bringing peace. And with those final words, we scan through the faces of those who held him dear as they watch him quietly accept his fate. We only knew him for 2 chapters, but Dora will go down as one of the most respectable characters across both mangas, and it's not even close. Because no other character had been dealt such a bad hand in life, and yet refused to let it fill their heart with hate. A lesson he tried to pass on to the twins, and despite Morrow initially having an outburst after the match due to feeling that Deborah disrespected Dora by not using its full power, he would go on to try to emulate that idea of peace from this moment forward. In fact, we learn at the very end of the chapter that it was actually his idea for them to travel across space, believing that if they can't find their true neighbors here on their own planet, then maybe they will on another. Which honestly is a wild idea, but hey, you gotta respect the kid. He dreams big. Cross, on the other hand, not so much. Losing Dora was just too much for him, and I feel as though we just watched a wall made of hate surround his heart, and any hope he had left in living the kind of life Dora dreamed of completely fade away. Hopefully, after hearing the story, Yuko will be able to chip away at that wall, and by the end of the manga, give him that hope again, but it's going to be a long process, and she has a very short timeline to do it. Now, one thing the chapter did leave me a bit confused on is what exactly Jabaloma is after, because his introduction in chapter 2 was just way too creepy for him to just be trying to find a way for his people in Japan to coexist. I feel like he has to be up to something. And now that we've gotten a better look at Deborah's character, I really doubt war is what he wants, because he promised Dora he'd protect the Remlians, and invoking war would be doing the exact opposite. So at this point, I think that Jabaloma is the real mastermind behind his plan to forcefully take over Japan, but I don't see how we got from the him we see here in this flashback to the more sinister one we met in the present day. And that is one major mystery we're going to have to solve in the future of the story, and another one is with Deborah's sister. Because when they show up at the end here, we don't get to see her face, but something tells me that now that she's been introduced, we will be seeing her sometime very soon. And because this chapter actually opens with a cute 4-coma story of when Tsurugi and Yuko were kids, and him supposedly having a crush on some girl. Shout out to Panda, by the way. I knew at some point we'd end up seeing him. But since the chapter opened with that, I kinda got the idea that maybe we're setting up a bit of a romantic subplot between Tsurugi and Deborah's sister. I know, it's a stretch. For all we know, we open the next chapter and we find out she died before they even left the planet. But I really feel like this is where the story is going. And if I'm right, their romance could be the thing that begins to instill the idea of peace between the two races and leads towards the Samorians and the Japanese truly becoming neighbors. But first, we have to get out of this flashback. And in order to do that, we have to get the Remlians from their planet onto ours. Something that we set up at the very end by Deborah revealing that Dora had left behind all the mule he dug up when building the canal for the Remlians. And after Morrow and Cross touch them, their cursed energy causes a bizarre reaction where the mule floats in the air and seemingly begins to form the ship they would use to travel to Earth. I'm not sure if this is where the flashback is going to end, but it does feel like a natural stopping point for the story. Though, if it is going to continue, I imagine it'll be to cover the reaction the Deskunte have to discovering all this mule and their attempts to steal it from them, setting up their desire to pursue the Remlians to Earth, and hopefully switching our main villains from being Deborah, Jabaloma, and Cross over to the people that continuously ruin their lives.